It's not as if the Christian community doesn't have things to be aware of. In Nigeria, it's been one of the worst years for Christians around the world, suffering persecution from the rise of Hindu nationalists. In India, over 200 churches were burned down last year. We had 9 out of 10 Christians murdered in the world last year would have been murdered in Nigeria. The Communist Party of China is disappearing priests and bishops all across the CCP, all across China. In September, we had the Christians in Artsakh ethnically cleansed from their home where they lived since the 2nd century, where they've been celebrating Mass and praying since the 2nd century. You would have thought that maybe Easter, if you wanted to make a political statement on Easter, it would have been a statement in support and solidarity with Christians who are suffering brutal persecution around the world. But instead, they have this perverse celebration at the White House, and they banned any religious symbols at the White House that day.
I had written about these subjects just recently, especially Nigeria, and how it's been such a bloody year for Christians there. And yet the Biden administration continues to insist Nigeria is not a country of special concern for religious persecution, which is absolutely baffling to a lot of activists. And when it comes to something like Artsakh, or the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, how often do you see any media coverage that mentions that this was a Christian population that was driven out of their homes by a conquering Muslim nation? I mean, there's just not a single peep about that.
Not a single peep. And it's worse. I don't know if you have seen this. It's kind of slipped through the press, but Azerbaijan, which just, last year committed an epic act of ethnic cleansing, was just a reward. They were given a reward for what they did by the Biden administration. Azerbaijan now is chairing COP29 in November, this climate conference that's absurd anyway. But to think that Azerbaijan would be given the leadership of COP29, less than a year after they ethnically cleansed the Armenians from Artsakh. But I saw this, with my work at the Vulnerable People Project. We serve vulnerable communities around the world. We're the last Western organization operating across Afghanistan. We're operating in the borders in the war with Russia and Ukraine. We're in Gaza. But with my work, I've seen this. When ISIS was ripping its way through the first-century Christian communities and Yazidi community, the proto-Semitic people, the Yazidi of Iraq, as they were being wiped from the face of the earth, I met with the young leader of ethnic minority in Iraq, and I asked her if she met with the U.S. State Department. She said, in fact, she did have one meeting with the State Department. Now, this was in 2016 at the height of ISIS genocide. I said, well, how did that meeting go? She said, well, they told me that we're not focused on ethnic issues right now, but LGBT issues. And so could you imagine how bizarre it must have been for this Iraqi woman, the leader of a people being wiped off the face of the earth, sitting across from a representative of the United States government, being told that the ethnic cleansing of your people isn't our focus because our focus right now is on LGBT issues. When I share the story, I feel like I'm telling a lie because it's so utterly absurd. But this is where we are as a country. This is where we are now.
And it's really difficult to make sense of almost anything this administration and a lot of the U.S. government for many years has done on this topic without coming to the conclusion that they just don't think persecuted Christians are a story. They're not important. They're not really a subject of concern, even if they're ethnically cleansed, driven from their homes, or outright massacred, as happens in Nigeria. It's not a big deal. It's not something that they feel is a crisis that needs to be spotlighted or have media attention paid to it, which I think is the key here. They understand that the government drives the media to a large degree and vice versa. And if they don't make a big deal at an official level about what happened to the Yazidis or to the Christians in Syria or to any of these other groups, then the media is not going to cover it as a big story and it's not going to get any cultural penetration.
Yeah, and then meanwhile, they force the LGBTQ agenda on these countries that just look at us like we've lost our mind. And as you know, Russia and China are weaponizing our use of LGBT ideology to pry our allies away from us and put them in the sphere of the Russia and China sphere, because the peoples of Africa and Asia are so repulsed by this agenda. In fact, I was in Ukraine last June. I had met with Zelensky's staff in Ukraine at the presidential palace, and in that meeting, I was advocating for them to press the brakes on some abortion agenda items that they were pushing forward. And they shared with me, Zelensky's staff, that they had been getting pressure from the U.S. and Germany to push these sort of, this abortion and trans ideology. The West, the United States and Germany were taking advantage of the war to force Ukraine, which is a country made up of conservative Christian farmers, right? It's the largest pro-life movement in Europe. It's the most Christian of the former Soviet republics. And here we are, the U.S. State Department is attempting to shove what they call pinkwashing or the pink agenda on the people of Ukraine in the midst of their war for their very existence. It's utterly unbelievable. But when you see Trans Visibility Day celebrated at the White House on Easter Sunday, that's a grave scandal. Now, and I'm a Catholic, and for the life of me, I can't imagine why Joe Biden has not been formally excommunicated at this point.
Well, that's the rub, though. He isn't, and neither have legions of rapidly pro-abortion Democrats that came before him. There were many times when various Christian organizations or the Catholic Church, the Vatican, could have stood up and said, this is it, you've crossed the line, you're not Catholic anymore, and they never do. And that's one of the reasons why the left was able to infiltrate the religion far more than the religion doing anything to reform the left. Jason Jones, president of the Human Rights Education and Relief Organization, producer, author, activist, and author of the book, The Great Campaign Against the Great Reset. Thanks for joining us today.